available to view after the fact. And I'll be sending out a link to that recording once it's posted on the web. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. I just wanted to start off by welcoming you to the Sustaining Barley Webinar Series. This is actually the first installment of this year's series. So appreciate everyone coming out. And this really is meant to serve as a forum for conversation and sharing of ideas so that we can advance sustainability in the malting barley industry. And we hope you'll be able to join us over the next several months. We've got various topics coming your way. And hopefully we'll be able to really highlight innovative research and practices throughout the supply chain that's helping the respective malting, brewing, and distilling industries meet their sustainability goals. I want to thank my partners on this series, the Brewing and Malting Barley Research Institute and the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Centre. And a big thank you to all of my members at the American Malting Barley Association for making this series possible. Today, each of our presenters will present for about 20 minutes each, leaving some time for Q&A at the end, and we will do Q&A at the very end. But feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat as we go along. And we really do encourage discussion in this series, and that's why we do this in a meeting format, not a webinar format. So please come off mute, turn on your camera at the very end, and let's have a discussion with our guest speakers. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to my co-host, Gina, who will introduce our first speaker for today.
Thanks, Ashley. Just get the bio up here quickly. Yeah, I'm really pleased to introduce Mitchell Japp. He is the Research and Extension Manager for SaskBarley. Mitchell joined SaskBarley in 2020 to coordinate the research portfolio and share the results of the research with farmers so they can implement the ideas on farm. SaskBarley has several options to get information. I encourage you to take a look at their website. And primarily, one of the key ones is the Barley Bin, which is SaskBarley's extension arm. Mitchell is excited about idea generation and seeing the result. He and his family live on an acreage near Lumsden, Saskatchewan. And I'd like to welcome Mitchell.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Ashley. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here or get my presentation started. Sorry, I got to share first and then start the presentation. Is that coming through all right on your end? Is it showing as full screen?
There it is.
Okay, good stuff. A little bit of lag time. So, so the topic title that I picked for my presentation here today is Regenerative-ish. And sorry, the wrong way here. This stems from an article that came in SaskBarley's magazine a couple of years ago, and that was when we first started hearing about regenerative agriculture from the barley industry, and so that. Sorry, I seem to have some type of timing on this one that I wasn't aware of. So I am going to go out of here and we'll just use the mode here. Turn off all of the other things here first. How's that? Well, should be okay that way. Okay, sorry about that.
Good.
Okay. I ran through it, but I was using the keys and it wasn't long enough on each slide to see the timing come in. So this article that we put out into our Barley Bin magazine 3 years ago, it was looking at regenerative ag from the lens of what we're producing here in Saskatchewan, in the context of hearing about it from maltsters and brewers, and we wanted to talk about how we viewed it as fitting into the context of Western Canadian agriculture. So the article, it dove into some of the things that we were hearing at the time, what regenerative agriculture is, and things like General Mills had recently launched a program for oats targeting 1 million acres to be produced using regenerative practices. And we were wondering if Saskatchewan and Western Canadian barley farmers would see similar programs offered, or even requests from buyers if the barley that they were buying was produced under regenerative agriculture principles. And so the article informed farmers in Saskatchewan on what regenerative ag is and isn't in some cases, and it offers some perspective on the considerations that might be important for discussions with buyers. And so I think in terms of the presentation today, it's important to establish a framework in terms of what to discuss. And so regenerative agriculture, it's different than organic agriculture, where organic is defined in regulation at level by government, whereas regenerative agriculture is principles that are commonly discussed in industry, but there is not necessarily any standards applied to it. Now, quite recently, the CSA, which I've always described as Canadian Standards Association, I'm not sure if they still describe themselves that way. They had put forward a document that proposes considerations for standardization. And within that, they have the same 5 principles that we talked about in our article 3 years ago, as those are the ones that seem to be consistent in the discussion around regenerative agriculture. And so those principles are to minimize soil disturbance, keep soil covered year-round, keep live plants and living roots in the soil, enhance biodiversity above and below ground, and incorporate farm animals onto the land. So the CSA document does go a little bit beyond those initial 5 principles, and they have included an additional 5 that they indicate are common enough to be discussed, but not necessarily as commonly agreed upon in the industry. So these aren't, like I said, this document is considerations for standardization, and it's not standards as of yet. But they list these ones that are on the screen, looking at efficient input use and reducing inputs, conservation and protection of water, fitting the principles to the farm, enhancing and restoring natural landscapes, and respect for human and non-human life and for the environment, which I think starts to blend into another set of principles that they have included in context, but not necessarily as agreed upon as those initial 5 principles. Those are socially focused, and I didn't think they were necessary to include today. I also think that it's important that we think about these principles in the climatic context that we have here in Western Canada. It's late October. This is not the scene we have outside yet, but it is coming soon. And so I think remembering that we are covered by snow for a significant portion of our year is part of that context in terms of regenerative agriculture principles. And our growing season is relatively short and hot, flanked by quite even shorter spring and fall seasons. the shoulder seasons to the main two, the summer and winter. In addition to the temperature constraints that we have, we are also often on the edge of a drought. This is a recent screen capture of the drought monitor that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada puts out. It puts most of the growing zone in Western Canada as either abnormally dry or not actively in drought. You see that it does show a lot of abnormally dry, severe drought, extreme drought in the north, but where we're growing most of the crops, not quite as bad. That's going to be based on some late season rains that we had in the southern part of the province. Certainly down in the southwest, it was much more severe earlier in the season. So we don't get the rainfall that that some of the regions that are really driving regenerative agriculture do get. And even within our zones, we do have extremes. So down in the southwest part of the province, from a Saskatchewan perspective, down in the southwest in that dry brown soil zone, there's severe limitations on moisture, but less so on growing season. The growing season is longer. They'll be planting in April, harvesting potentially in July or August, and still be open frost-free days into September and October. But they may not have the moisture to be able to do much with that extra time. Whereas in the Northeast, we get the opposite extreme, where they tend to have some moisture, enough for good growing conditions, but a much shorter growing season. And then if we look down into the Southeast, just on the Saskatchewan side of Brandon, that's where maybe we hit that sweet spot of a little bit more moisture and a longer growing season. That's a pretty small area in Saskatchewan. So I think as a starting point for how I think about where we're at with regenerative ag, I think about where we are in terms of sustainability. And we had a report published this summer from the Global Institute for Food Security, where they partnered with Nathan Peltier's lab. Nathan was a presenter on this series last year, and they looked at the sustainability from a carbon dioxide climate change perspective for barley production in Saskatchewan, Western Canada, compared to some major competitive regions, looking at Australia and France in this chart here. And they attribute the stark differences that you see on this chart primarily to the success and widespread adoption of the zero and minimal till farming operations, adoption of herbicide-tolerant canola, diverse crop rotation, and the inclusion of pulse crops, which do fix their own nitrogen. And so Saskatchewan and Western Canada have been leaders in many of these areas over the past number of decades, and it's showing up in terms of farm operations and in the data we get from research on sustainability. So if we go back to those 5 principles that I mentioned at the start that are included in that CSA brief, the first one is minimizing soil disturbance, and that is one that is done really well and has been for decades on Saskatchewan and Western Canadian farms. So there's a significant amount of protection of the soil, and especially when there's low residue to seed into. So the inclusion of pulse crops is very good from a nitrogen perspective, but they do tend to leave very, very low residue. And so minimizing the disturbance when seeding into a low residue crop like pulses does an exceptional job of helping to maintain the soil and whatever structure that residue does provide and protection. It is enhanced by this seeding systems that are used. And those seeding systems still benefit higher residue crops, so following crop like barley, where there's a protection of the soil and for the new growing crop. And so the technology does continue to change. So we see introductions of technology like RTK, as well as precision management, so zone-based management of inputs, allowing farmers to, seed between the rows using that RTK technology. So really minimizing the disturbance of the standing stubble that is there, and applying nutrients and other inputs based on what they have in the ground, and really targeted to what that zone needs in terms of optimizing production and minimizing the inputs that go into it, so that they can be used efficiently. Inputs are really expensive, and farmers want to make sure that they're using those inputs well. So I think because zero till and minimum till has been practiced for so long on prairie farms, we have a pretty good understanding of what some of those benefits are, and I've summarized them here. I haven't gone deeply into detail on what those are, but in terms of soil health, climate change mitigation, and both agronomic and economic benefits, the benefits are widespread, and I think where they come out as a strong win is because they do match environmental, operational, or agronomic needs and the economic benefits. So it's a win-win-win situation that has led to some of those really stark differences that we see in Western Canadian production in terms of sustainability. Other regions where there have not either had zero till for as long or are not currently utilizing it. So the second and third points, principles, are going to cover together as one, because they are so closely integrated in a farming system. And so, keeping in mind that climatic context where we are definitely find it easy to keep the soil covered when there's snow on the ground. That's not a problem. But maintaining that snow on the field is something that can be done because of how the zero-till system works. And we know that we've got research out of Swift Current that shows benefits of taller stubble. And so this is from a more northern zone where they're not necessarily wanting to retain snow and moisture, but there is flexibility in harvesting systems to be able to retain stubble of varying heights, and to be able to capture snow and moisture and keep soil well in place and not be blowing around or moving off field through water erosion. So this gives you a good example of what soil cover looks like. You look from above before harvest and you wouldn't see the ground at all. After harvest, you can look straight down, and yes, there will be some bare ground, but those stubble and roots associated with that stubble keep that soil well anchored in the ground and keep it from moving from various other forms of erosion. So when seeding into standing stubble, this is what it looks like. So that year-round cover is well provided, but it's not necessarily a living cover. And so I think keeping that climatic context in front of our minds is remembering that so much of our production area is experiencing terminal drought into late August. That frost-free period is pretty limiting on getting a cover crop established, and moisture conservation. So 2021 was a severe drought in Western Canada, and I think a large part of the northern US. But we did end up with some decent moisture late in the growing season, far too late to actually save the crop. But what happened was we got a lot of shelling out in the dry conditions, and with that late season moisture, we had a lot of volunteer crop growth, and we had one of the agronomists in the province who was looking at it at a field where the farmer had managed that volunteer crop growth with a fall herbicide application, and using one of the soil moisture testing tools that he had available, found that it was in a corner where that volunteer crop had not been managed compared to where it had been. There was a significantly reduced amount of available water in that area, and so that's one of the reasons why cover crop is so challenging in a dry environment like we're producing in here. So the fourth one was enhancing biodiversity, and I think it speaks both to above ground and below ground biodiversity. The focus, I think, is on the crop basket that we grow in Western Canada. This is Saskatchewan data. It can be easily extrapolated, I think, both to Manitoba and Alberta to represent all of Western Canada, where we've got about half of the basket is in cereals, a little more than a third probably in oil seeds, and somewhere around a quarter or so in pulse crops. So I think that represents a significant win in terms of where we were a few decades ago. I looked at the data from 40 years ago in 1984, and that crop basket then was nearly 90% cereal crops. So there's been a significant change, and that was a contributing factor in that sustainability data that GIFS had presented, where I had the slide earlier. So I guess before moving on entirely from that one, I think we have some data as well that supports the notion of increased microbial soil microbial activity and diversity with introduction of zero-till. Prior to that, a lot of the province in Western Canada was using a follow system, and so that really caused a disruption in soil microbes. But having continuous cropping and having something growing on the fields year after year led to significant improvements and changes in the microbes and soil life. So the last of the principles was incorporating livestock, and I looked at this, and to me this is a scalability issue. It's not necessarily not that it's not a sound principle to incorporate livestock. It's just I'm not sure how we get there because of the vast amount of acres. If you think about it from that perspective, it would make a significant change to the current beef herd, assuming we're talking about cattle. Even at a very conservative utilization of any cover crops that were used, or even just fall stubble on what are currently crop farms only. And so that, to me, that the logistics of it are just too challenging to figure out how that can be done at scale. Now, for a localized farm, that makes a lot of sense if it can fit in. And I think where some of the positive examples of regenerative agriculture utilization are coming from are often a combination or mixed farm with crops and livestock. So if we look for comparisons to where we're at beyond the 5 principles, and include those ones that were in the CSA document, I think we look at the 5 principles, and I see our zero and minimum till as fitting with and aligning with the regenerative ag principles at about 60 to 80%. So it's got the minimum disturbance, it's got continuous cover, there's living plants for the majority of the time, and arguably the time that it's available to it. And there's good biodiversity, but largely fail on the incorporation of livestock. So I think looking at these 5 other tenets of regenerative ag that are up for consideration, nutrient cycling and increased organic matter, along with low disturbance application systems, make input use very efficient. So that's, I think, a clear win there. Continuous cover protects soils from erosion. It slows down, captures water where it is. It increases water infiltration. And so when that runoff does occur, that water tends to be moving slower and contains less nutrients in it. I think the downside of it is that there's a lot of soluble phosphorus that is in surface residue, and that does move off field with water. So I think the best way to manage for that is to be able to slow that water down enough that it's passing through systems and maybe moving into water bodies in a different way than it currently is. But it's not a clear way on how that can be reduced significantly, because that residue is going to contain phosphorus, and if there's any water moving, it's going to move some phosphorus with it. I'm not sure there's direct wins on the natural landscapes, but zero-till is certainly beneficial for a large number of wildlife by providing cover. The last one, I'm not sure of quite how the fit is there, but I would say that that it is somewhat contextual and subjective, and so I think it can be viewed how an individual wants. And I think that would be one of the challenges for the regenerative ag folks, is how to be able to have that applied consistently if they are looking to set up standards. So my view is that barley and crop production in Western Canada is definitely regenerative-ish. I would ask the question, are there more lessons to be learned? And I think there are. So, you know, there's benefits to farmers, and I think that's important that those are considered very, very clearly in the development of any standards. So I think zero-till is a success because it is a combination of benefiting agronomics, economics, and the environment. I think we had some recent discussions about reducing nitrous oxide emissions. That one saw a lot of pushback because it was only an additional cost, no clear benefits. It's really important to follow the science. There's farmers that are often out in the lead. We call them the bleeding edge. They experiment, try new things. Some things fail, some work, but they innovate and adapt, and lots of good wins there. So I think adapting to where scientists are observing, and with zero-till, the practices, they were adopted from the farmers by scientists, and then studied, and the benefits were very clear, and then they led to widespread adoption. Addressing problems head on. So I think it's important that when there are issues like how do you fit a cover crop in the climate context we have in Western Canada, that we need to look at that, and it's important. And it worked in zero-till because they addressed challenges like straw management head on. Zero-till didn't start in the spring; it started at harvest time with the right chopping and spreading equipment, and scalability is important too. And then focusing on success. You know, the infographic I've got posted here at the side. This is not helpful to be able to take that tack that regenerative agriculture producers are the ones that are aligned with winning, and the other ones are just getting left in the dust. So I think look at where there is where there are benefits and talk about those benefits, but we don't need to diminish what other agriculture is. And so sorry with the slideshow not working properly. I'll just slide that picture out of the way for now. So next steps, I think, is remember how close we are with our current production systems. We have to match our climatic constraints. You know, spending money on planting a cover crop that's not going to grow or is going to take rob moisture from yield from the next year isn't a good fit. Look for proven benefits. I think there's lots of good stories out there, testimonials from farmers, including a recent article from Narwhal, which is where that picture is from. These are leading edge producers who are trying new things, but we need to figure out if they're adaptable and scalable for other farms. Most of them seem to have livestock, so we need to figure out where the benefits are coming just for the crop producers. So I think looking for opportunities, barley does have a shorter growing season than most crops. If a cover crop did have time to grow, it could fit after barley. Zone management is something we were talked about earlier, and that could have an implication for some of the regenerative ag principles like cover crops. Most areas we want to conserve moisture, but we get down into low-lying areas, we want to maybe utilize some of that in the fall. And so getting that on the ground after the harvest is done could potentially help those areas. We've already done some initial looks at intercropping, but sticking within one crop using different varieties to manage the disease. But there could be some benefits to look at there. There's also challenges that go along with it, so addressing those challenges head on. Emerging technology for fenceless barriers in livestock could look at different integration between ranches and crop farms. And it raises questions like how would having grazing animals on a farm help with the management of herbicide-resistant weeds like kochia and wild oats, and considering things like short rotation forages. So we've got some research on that. Some farmers that are doing it. Is there a benefit on a wider scale? So I think the conversion to zero-till was driven by improved economics and agronomics. Those adoption of new practices can be facilitated by incentives, but programs have to be beneficial to be adopted, and the practices have to be beneficial to be able to be retained after incentives go away. So yeah, regenerative-ish. I think barley production in Western Canada is very sustainable. Can it be improved? Yes, and it does continue to be so as farmers adopt new practices and innovate on their own.
All right. Thanks, Mitchell.
Yeah, sorry about the slides.
Hey, no worries. No
surprised
worries.
me.
No worries. And we'll hold any questions for him till the end. And Brady, if you want to go ahead and come on camera and go ahead and share your slides, I will do your introduction. And it's a nice segue. Mitchell gave a much more kind of high-level overview of regenerative ag principles. Brady is actually going to kind of zero in on one of those practices that gets talked about a lot, cover crops, and specifically wanted to bring him in because when we did our survey of people that attended the webinars last year, cover crops was the #1 requested item to address in the series this year. It is tricky though, because there's not a lot of people using cover crops in barley production systems. A lot of that has to do with that climatic context that Mitchell was talking about. We oftentimes are growing barley in regions, maybe cover crops are a little bit trickier. So before I turn it over, Brady, just want to share that his expertise really lies at the confluence of soil fertility, soil health, and farmer outreach. He is originally from Wisconsin and worked several years as a crop advisor and nutrient management planner before joining North Dakota State University in 2020. In his current position as Assistant Professor of Extension Soil Science, he collaborates with researchers, extension personnel, and producers to conduct research and outreach to help North Dakota farmers implement soil conservation practices and improve fertility management. So with that, Brady, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you for that introduction, Ashley. As we talked about here, as Ashley mentioned, as Mitchell mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities for cover crops in barley systems and in the northern Great Plains, but also there's a lot of challenges. And anytime I talk about cover crops or how to implement them in the system, it's always through that lens of reasonable expectations. What can we attain through cover crops? What can't we attain? And how do we best set ourselves up for success? So over the next 20 minutes, the main points I want to cover here, firstly, is what really is a cover crop. When you talk to different groups of people, they have different ideas of what it actually is. And I think having those preconceived notions of what a cover crop is can help to skew what our idea of successful cover crop may look like. We'll talk a little bit about the cover crop triangle. So again, opportunities on how to measure cover crop success. Talk about opportunities specifically for cover crops and barley systems, and then wrap things up with putting it all into perspective. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be posing some more theoretical cover crop things, and then also weaving in some research that we actually carried out in North Dakota on barley systems. So setting the stage first, what actually is a cover crop? Of course, everybody has a definition, starting with the United States Department of Agriculture with simply grasses, legumes, forbs planted for seasonal vegetative cover. So that really opens up the doors to a lot of different things that could be classified as a cover crop. Of course, as a more broad definition that allows us potentially to have more opportunities. Whereas if we look at a definition from the MCCC, so the Midwest Cover Crop Council, they start to hone in a little bit more on, plants seeded into agricultural fields. Of course, we know that is the basic tenet of a cover crop, either within or outside of the regular growing season, with the primary purpose of improving or maintaining ecosystem quality. Okay, so set the stage here. What can success look like based on your definition of cover crop? Well, with the basic USDA, if we just plant something, outside of the season we normally have growing things on the field, we've got a cover crop. Success then could be measured by simply having something green in that field. If we go with the more robust definition where we really want to see improving ecosystem quality or field outcomes, now that gets much more difficult to measure what success is. And I think depending on which definition you lean towards, you have a different measurement for what success may look like in your particular system. So quite often I have farmers and consultants call me interested in, I want to plant a cover crop on my field this year. Okay, my first question always is, well, why? What are your goals? And I would say, 75% of the time, their answer is, well, for soil health. I want to plant this cover crop for soil health. Well, that doesn't tell me a lot, okay? You know that cover crops have a lot of different potential outcomes. And, this list you'll see here going forward, goes against everything that, should be on a PowerPoint slide. But to make the point of, we can plant cover crops for reduced erosion, to maintain or increase soil organic matter, improve aggregate stability, improve habitat for soil organisms, reduce water quality degradation, use it for the management of pest and weed pressure, talking about moisture management, either too much or too little, the reduction of soil compaction to supply nitrogen and to improve habitat. And this is kind of an overwhelming list. But the first step in setting reasonable expectations for yourself is to really hone in on what we want to gain from planting that cover crop, because no single cover crop species planted in 1 year can attain all of these outcomes. And if we're expecting to attain all of these, we're never going to truly succeed in planting a cover crop. So if the first step is, let's hone in on what we really want to attain with this cover crop. And then we can start making plans for what it's actually going to take to reach those goals. So I've mentioned here several times about, attaining a successful cover crop. Okay, what is the measuring stick that we're using to measure what our success is? And really recognizing that there isn't a single measuring stick we're using. One, because we have so many different potential outcomes or potential goals we're trying to reach. And also we're trying to fit it into very different systems, some of which are just more conducive to overall cover crop growth and productivity. So these are a few pictures that I've collected through my research here in North Dakota and then some from other sources, which by some may be viewed as successful or non-successful cover crops. The goal here is to talk about barley, but as an example of interseeding cover crops into corn. Okay, so this was some research that we did in south central North Dakota, where the farmer was very disappointed in this cover crop. He didn't see the biomass. The radishes that you see growing in that picture are relatively small. But then I showed it to the next person who was excited about it. In his mind, that was a very, very successful cover crop. So again, what are your goals? If your goal is biomass, I guess that's not successful. If your goal was diversity and providing a living root, that of course was a success. This was from a research project that I did here in North Dakota looking at volunteer barley and its use as a cover crop, which I'll talk more about in this presentation. And to some, again, this may look like a failure. In my mind, we had that living root. We helped to prevent erosion. Again, that's success depending on how you view your goals of cover crops. Some folks would only say, a successful cover crop is this very diverse mix. We have sunflowers and oats and there's some millet and stuff in there. Okay, that may be a successful cover crop for some, but it may not work in all systems. And primarily, that's a very expensive cover crop mix. By spending that money, are we attaining some of those goals that we talked about on the previous slide at any higher rate than potentially a less expensive cover crop mix? And then lastly, the idea of planting, winter cereals as an example, where, some folks say if you're going to harvest it, it's not a cover crop. Well, in my mind, as a soil conservationist, if we can leverage winter cereals, they're providing those benefits that a cover crop also would, with then the opportunity of making some money off that cash crop. So why do I bring up all of these metrics of what success may look like? What are our goals? It's because at the end of the day, and this is a quote from an agronomist here in North Dakota that I really like, is recognizing cover crops are like tools in a toolbox. Sometimes you need pliers, sometimes you need a screwdriver. Recognizing that not everything is going to work everywhere and that we can leverage the strengths and weaknesses of different cover crops and different cover crop systems to work in our advantage. When you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that approach doesn't necessarily work with cover crops. So breaking down success a little bit more. So those of you that have a plant pathology background or took any plant pathology, you'll recognize what they call the disease triangle. So balancing a host, a pathogen, and the environment, all things that need to be present for a disease to occur. In a similar way, obviously in a more positive light, we can look at the cover crops as well. So we need good field conditions, the moisture that Mitchell had talked about, in order to have a successful cover crop. Without those proper field conditions, we're very much limiting our success of that cover crop. We need to have the opportunity for time. Okay, Mitchell mentioned in his presentations, if cover crops do have an opportunity, they certainly could be able to fit after barley. We have that time opportunity. But without that proper timing, again, success is slowly being depleted even more. And then lastly, which is I think what most people think about as the most important thing in cover crops, is the seeds and the seeding. Well, you could, put all your eggs in one basket with an expensive cover crop mix and seed it the best you can. But if you don't have the proper timing and you don't have those field conditions, we're not going to have success. So balancing all of those, setting ourselves up for reasonable expectations for cover crop success is going to be the most important thing. So let's break down each of those three legs a little bit. So starting out with time. So here's a little table looking at crops in North Dakota. So if we figure that our median first date of killing frost in North Dakota is around September 26th, and then we look at some of the other major crops across the state, barley really does give us the best window for being able to plant a cover crop. You know, average harvest date is around August 18th. That gives us 38 days until we'd likely see a frost termination from that cover crop. None of our other major crops across the state have that much of an opportunity. And especially when people start thinking about, you know, corn and soybean rotations, potentially bringing wheat into it, there's really not a lot of good opportunities for those cover crops. But if we can bring barley into our systems, there's a great opportunity for cover crops, or if we already have barley into our systems, to potentially improve the sustainability or economic services of that crop by following it up with a well-planned cover crop. So here I'm going to weave in a little bit of that research that we did in North Dakota. First of all, just explaining some of that research that we did. So over 2020 and 2021, we established 4 Eastern North Dakota experimental sites. So these experiments were set up on previous barley nitrogen rate studies, malting barley nitrogen rate studies, and then we followed it up after harvest by planting a cover crop. Okay, and we chose this cover crop based on what other farmers were doing in the area, and then also, like I'll talk about here in a couple more slides, looking at what the potential goals of that is. So we ended up using brown flax, radish, fava bean, and then leveraging that volunteer barley. And then the data that I'll present here in a couple more slides is the biomass at the time of the first killing frost, so above ground biomass of those cover crops. So we've talked about field condition, or excuse me, we've talked about time. Let's talk a little bit about seeds and seeding. Okay, so when we select a cover crop to plant, it really should be based on what is the function of that cover crop, how well does it fit in our rotation, and what opportunities do we have for planting that cover crop? Okay, there's certain seeds that we know need to be drilled in or need to be below ground in order to germinate well versus the cover crops that we could just broadcast on the surface and they'll be perfectly happy to grow that way. So in this previous study that I had talked about, we used, first of all, flax as for the idea of hoping to facilitate nutrient release and capture. We used radishes as a soil loosener to help break some of those compaction in the no-till systems that those studies were taking place in. We had the goal of fixing nitrogen. Okay, so that's where that fava bean component came in. And then lastly, with the volunteer rye, or excuse me, the volunteer barley, allowing that to grow to provide that fibrous root system, and then of course preventing some sort of erosion control and perhaps some height to capture snow throughout the winter. And again, the planting method, one was dependent on the fava bean, for example, which had to be planted below ground. So we chose to drill these cover crops in. And then, you know, that decision would have to change if we only had the opportunity perhaps to broadcast that cover crop. So fortunately, we had a drill available to us, but that may not be the case for farmers, for example, who may have to then develop a mix based on broadcasting or aerial seeding. So here's some data from that North Dakota research. So the 4 site years there based in environment, and you can see some of the cover crop components did much better than the others. Obviously the small grain component, the barley, produced anywhere from 200 up to 2,800 pounds of biomass per acre. Excuse me, the unit there in kilograms per hectare is incorrect. This was converted over to pounds per acre. And as you can see, the radish was really sporadic. Some years it did well, some years it didn't. And then overall, the flax and fava bean just didn't compete real well with that mix. Okay, so that perhaps the volunteer barley was a little bit too aggressive and helped to flush out some of those other cover crops. But overall, we had decent biomass production in these fields. And I'll explain here in further slides why we have so many, high and low years. And that really was dependent on the field conditions. Okay, so if we start thinking about how to plan a cover crop into our barley system, the first question we have to ask is, what are those managed conditions? So the different field conditions that we can do something about that may help make a cover crop more or less successful. First thing, is that field tilled or is it no-till? Because that's going to change how we're going to be able to plant that cover crop. If we're in a tilled system, likely a broadcast cover crop may have a better take than it would in a high residue no-till system. In a high residue no-till system, drilling may be a better opportunity, but now we have to have the right equipment in order to drill into that residue. And then, of course, from a weed control standpoint, okay, if we have a barley field that had a lot of weeds in it, we need to figure out how to terminate those before we plant the cover crop so that we're not reseeding those weeds out in that field. And that could be either through mechanical or chemical control of those weeds, which then will change the way that we follow up with that cover crop. And then, of course, the unmanaged field conditions, things that we can't necessarily do anything about. That first kind of ties in with the time factor of it, is just the length of growing season. Are we going to have an early or a late fall? Even though after barley, on average, we have the greatest opportunity for a long growing season, that may not always be the case every year. And then, of course, the most important is water. Okay, are we in a dry year? Are we in a wet year? And that's really going to make or break the success of a cover crop. So as a shout out to some of my Canadian friends that are on here, this is a book I really enjoy, and I think every soil scientist or agronomist should have on their shelf, is Henry's Handbook of Soil and Water. And a quote I pull out of there, he has it more focused on the soil forming factors, but we can also look at it under the lens of a success for a cover crop. Okay, we need the seed, we need the time, we need to have good planting conditions, but at the end of the day, what really makes a difference, and it's the same as the soil forming factors, is water, 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 and snow. Okay, and there's some years that we can do everything right, but if we don't receive those timely rains, as Mitchell mentioned in his presentation, we're just not going to have success. Okay. So when I showed the slide a little bit earlier, I mentioned that, there's quite a range there, 2,800 all the way down to 210 pounds per acre. Why such a discrepancy? Again, what is success? Need is water, 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 and sometimes snow, okay, to make that happen. So in the very dry years during that cover crop growth period, we had very poor biomass production. But on the years that we had an above average rainfall, we had very, very successful cover crops. So if we figure an average year, there's still a good opportunity for that cover crop to grow, to produce average biomass, but we have to set ourselves up with reasonable expectation. What is that late summer, early fall rainfall going to look like? And then also helping us to decide, if we're in droughty conditions where there isn't enough moisture, maybe we scale back some of those expenses that we spend for more expensive seed or some of the more expensive planting practices, in anticipation for probably not having a lot of biomass production. Again, leveraging some of those volunteer crops in our favor. It's a free cover crop coming out of the back of the combine. How can we better manage those to have success? And I had sent to Ashley, and she'll post with the website a little handout talking about different ways to leverage that volunteer cover crop for success, and putting some dollars and cents to that as well. So in this particular study, our hope and our goals were to fix nitrogen, to take up residual nitrogen, provide ground cover, and provide nutrient cycling outcomes. What did we attain with the single year of cover crop? Well, we significantly reduced our fall nitrate levels, which we could expect from any cover crop that has decent biomass production. Okay, drawing down that residual nitrate keeping it tied up throughout the growing season. I don't have the data table in here, but throughout this project, we could see significantly lower fall nitrate levels where the cover crop was grown. But then in the spring, when we resampled it, there were no differences between the cover crop and the non-cover crop, and not in the sense that it released it, but actually the nitrogen in the non-cover crop treatments were lost from the system, but it was still held in the cover crop. And then later on in future years, we could see some positive outcomes from that trapped or that sequestered nitrogen. We didn't see any significant differences in aggregate stability following 1 year of cover crop. Again, this is something that's going to take multiple years of cover cropping and system changes to see. But if some people set that goal for themselves that in 1 year we're going to have much better infiltration and aggregate stability, that's not necessarily a reasonable expectation. We didn't see any changes in bulk density following that single year of cover crop. Again, these are things that take a long time to change, in recognizing that if we don't see these outcomes after the first year, that it wasn't a failure. It's just we don't have the time or the full rotation to really bring those things to fruition. But from an erosion control standpoint, we didn't quantify it in the study, but absolutely it would help to reduce erosion. Having that green cover on the surface, especially in tilled fields, is an outcome that we can visually see every year. And I think in of itself, if we do control erosions in our fields, that we're having very positive soil health outcomes. And of course, everything we do on farm has to be under the lens of finances. What can we afford to do? How perhaps can we make them, more economically palatable? And the handout that I have that'll be attached to this dives into this a little bit more. But talking about, if we were to go in and plant a cover crop, it's going to cost us around $51 per acre. And that's in herbicide. So trying to manage those weeds following barley, $13 on average for seed, plus the planting costs. The benefit, of course, is that we can select those species for specific outcomes, but there's that significant cost there. Does that fit economically into our systems? Whereas in barley, we have the opportunity to leverage that volunteer crop, okay? And we can significantly reduce costs by simply, managing the weeds immediately following harvest and then allowing that volunteer to grow. So at about $21 to do that weed control measure, of course, if we're in a clean field, this would be a $0 cover crop by just allowing it to grow. So the benefit of that, it's a low cost cover crop option. The drawbacks, we may have an uneven stand, and then finding ways to have to manage that volunteer. If we have weeds in it, we'll have to find ways to manage that volunteer while also still having timely weed management. So wrapping things up here with a few take-home points, set reasonable goals before planting and implementing those cover crop practices. We can hone then what we plan to do based on what we want our outcomes to be, whether it be for soil health or from moisture management in one direction or the other. Growing that cover crop to help capture some snow can actually be a moisture increasing practice versus having cover crops that would overwinter to help draw down that moisture in the spring as a moisture management in a no-till system, depending on what your goals are and your particular region. Again, recognizing cover crops are tools. Each has a specific use. Choose species that meet your goals. And then sometimes recognizing, and I think this is important for a lot of the company folks that I talk to who are trying to encourage their farmers to grow cover crops, is sometimes success is just out of the farmer's control. We can do everything right and we can follow a plan, but if we don't receive the moisture, if we have an early fall, we may not have success due to of no fault of our own. And then lastly, wrapping up with not all cover crop goals can be met in 1 year of planting. Some certainly can, but others are going to take a very large shift in our cropping systems to see those same outcomes. So with that, thanks again for having me on today, and hopefully that shed a little bit of light into setting ourselves up for success with reasonable goals.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brady, for that. And I know at least the practice of essentially letting some barley out the back of the combine as being a cover crop tool was pretty new to me in the last few years that I've worked more in barley production systems. So I do think it's an interesting tool in the toolbox. So I'm glad that you shared some of that work that you've done. And that fact sheet is already posted to the event page, so you guys can access that and learn more about that study. So with that, if you want to go ahead, perfect, stop share. I just wanted to pop up the promo for our next webinar, which will be in November. Hopefully that's showing through now. And we have time, at least I have time. I recognize we're at the top of the hour, but we've got some time to field some questions for folks that are still on that would like to ask anything of our presenters today. So if you have a question, either you can drop it in the chat or go ahead and come off mute.
Ashley, Brian Rossnagle here from Saskatoon. This is more of a comment. First, really good presentation, both of you guys. That's exactly what people need to hear. But I just wanted to make the comment, and you did put the emphasis on water, but a comment for those of you who are not from Western Canada. Mitch put up the most recent Ag Canada drought monitor graph for the Western Canada. But you need to understand that, as Mitchell said, we're on a knife edge. Most of Western Canada, barley growing region, is on a knife edge every year with regard to moisture. And that drought monitor, if you compare that to one, say, for Iowa and Illinois, it might look like, oh, well, there's lots of moisture in Western Canada this year. But remember, those numbers are relative to some standard. And enough moisture in Western Canada, it would be unbelievable drought in Illinois and Iowa. Drought in Illinois and Iowa could often be twice the amount of moisture we have in a given year. And just as a little bit of analogy example for you, when I was quite young in my career, I was fortunate enough to go to a meeting in Scandinavia, and I saw this presentation was going to be on drought tolerant breeding for drought tolerance, and it was in oats actually, but that doesn't really matter. And I went to the presentation and I was following it very closely, and I was really excited. And then all of a sudden, the slide came up, and I realized the guy's drought treatment was 3 times our annual average precipitation in Saskatchewan. So it's all about water, as Les Henry, the late Les Henry now, unfortunately, Les was still with us to talk about this stuff. It's all about water. And the fact is that in most of Western North Dakota, most of Montana, and all of Western Canada, with the exception maybe of the Peace River, where we don't have enough time, it's just too damn dry. And also keep in mind, I hate to be quite so crude and negative perhaps, but just take a look at who's making the money off this whole business. It's all the guys in the seed cover crop business. It's not the farmers. Thanks.
Any other questions?
This is MJ.
Hey, MJ.
Hey there. I wanted to know if there are good disease studies about what happens when you do your cover crop alternate with barley itself. In drought, yeah, you don't have much problem with fusarium, but some of our areas and some years you may have a significant fungal impact.
Yeah, I think with some of the work that we've done here, of course, my friends in pathology are very scared at the idea of green bridging, both for diseases and then also the entomology folks for insects. So I think it's, again, important to look at your entire system. If you're in, a continual small grain type rotation, obviously not having that volunteer or small grain cover crop is going to be important. If you're able to follow that volunteer cover crop up with a non-host plant for whatever particular disease or insect you're interested in is incredibly important from an IPM standpoint. So yeah, really finding things that fit or don't fit into your rotation are important.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, we'll go ahead and conclude then.